Can Christians today support IVF, in vitro fertilization, or surrogacy? Can you be both pro-life and support IVF? Today we're going to talk about those very, very sensitive and difficult topics today from a Christian conservative perspective. This is Deconstructing the Culture. I am your host, Elisa Steele. Welcome to this episode of Deconstructing the Culture. I'm going to say a special welcome for those of you who I know will be first-time listeners this episode more than any other, simply because this is a very, very hotly contested subject, while at the same time being a subject matter that is not often talked about in the open. I realized this for the first time because I very briefly talked about in vitro fertilization, IVF, maybe a couple of months ago, and it was very brief. I did not dedicate an entire episode to it the way I am today, and people were very hungry, and I had a lot of new listeners, and it made me realize I did not spend enough time on that. I did not discuss all the aspects of IVF, and I did not even touch on surrogacy, and surrogacy is becoming a bigger and bigger phenomenon in today's Western world. So I'm going to be totally open with you here at the beginning. If you are a man listening to this, bro, you're in the right place. Yes, this episode is going to be more targeted towards my female audience, a very large female audience with conservative babes, but I believe that men need this information. I know some people feel a little maybe more conservative about talking about these issues with mixed genders than I do. I personally have always felt that all men need to know about abortion. They need to know about reproductive issues. They need to know about surrogacy. They need to know about IVF. I don't think that this is a women's topic. While it does more directly apply to women, I believe that, all men need to know this information because these men will become fathers, they'll become grandfathers, they will be boyfriends, they will be brothers. These are big issues of our time, and I don't believe that there should be exclusively discussed by and known by women. So men, if you're listening to this episode, you're in the right place. I do think that men need this information as well. With that said, of course, I will be speaking more primarily to my female audience. Now, also, while I think this episode is for men and women, I also think that this episode, to some degree and with discretion, is also for teenagers. This is going to be some very, it's a tough topic all around. So you decide, parents, I know some of you listen to this with your children around, you decide, based on their age and their maturity and whether or not you discuss these matters with them anyways, whether or not this is an episode you want them to listen to. But I personally encourage teenagers to be aware of these topics. I do think teenagers, even young teenagers, need to know about birth control and IVF and these heavier topics, because whether or not they are directly facing this in the near future, they will face it as they enter into their 20s and when they get married, and more importantly, their friends will also be facing some of these issues, more specifically birth control, not so much IVF, obviously. So I personally was raised in a family that was very open in a healthy way about talking about sex and all things reproductive and all things the miracle of life. I thought it was interesting because I did not know that that was unusual to my family until I grew up. When I married my husband, I had to explain how reproduction and ovulation works. He knew the basics, obviously, but he didn't understand like the nitty-gritties of like an egg dropping and being fertilized. I had to explain that to him, and I didn't know that a lot of men weren't familiar with that, or that they aren't familiar with that information, because I was raised in a family where when I got, maybe, I don't know if it was the exact same time, but my brother, who's probably 19 months younger than I am, he was given the same information, or close to the same information. I probably got it way more in depth, but he was given the same basic information that I was about how babies are made and how reproductive, a female's reproductive organs work. So I think personally that especially female teens should have this information. And I was, again, raised in a home where we talked about the miracle of life pretty openly as a family. Now, I also want to mention, for those of you who might be concerned, is this too early to have my teenagers, you know, listen to or be more aware of these issues? You have to decide that based on their maturity, but the only thing I would add is that the world will decide that your teenager and your child, but mostly your teenagers, they're going to decide probably sooner than you will that this information is stuff that they need to know, and they'll probably teach it in a way that you don't necessarily agree with, specifically when it comes to birth control and when life starts, and whether or not it starts at conception or later on in life, and that makes abortion okay. So I would just say that whenever you wonder if you should have those deeper conversations, the answer is probably yes. I feel the same way about talking about pornography with your children or abortion. You unfortunately have to have those conversations with your children and teenagers sooner than we may have had to in the past traditionally, but this is where our world's at. All right, with that said, I want to preface this whole conversation with maybe even just a prayerful thought that you would understand my heart, and a prayerful hope that you would understand that I say everything I'm about to say, not with condemnation or harshness, but with the most loving attitude I can. I am not obviously a doctor or a nurse. I am a fallible human being who's done my research and read the Bible and tried to bring the two together and understand them the best that I know how. So obviously, if you have feedback or disagreements or maybe something that I may have missed, please feel free to enlighten me. And I don't mean that sarcastically, I mean that literally. Please send me an email, message me on Instagram. Right now my Instagram box has like hundreds of unchecked messages, but I will get to them eventually. Email, you're more likely to catch me. I do check my emails. So I just want you to know that I'm sharing my heart and where I have, through my own prayer and study of the Bible and also of science, and the issues that face our world today. This is where I have found myself. So I also hope that even if you don't agree with me on these issues, which many of you won't, I know that because I briefly posted about it a few months ago, and I know many of you won't agree with me on this, but I want to share, hopefully, either new information or, if anything, maybe just a new perspective. And feel free to share yours back with me. I would really love to hear that. Now, I want to also, another thought I want to bring into this conversation before we dive directly into surrogacy and IVF is, I think before we go in, we need to recognize that our culture views children differently than Christians do. Or I would hope that Christians see children more as a blessing rather than how the world sees them, because the Bible does make it very clear that children are a blessing, that they are an inheritance to their family, that you know, that they're a positive. There's nowhere in the Bible where it says, well, children, man, they're a lot of work. I don't think you should have them. That's just way too much sacrifice. No, you're not going to find that attitude in the Bible, but you're definitely going to very easily find that in the world. We know that toxic mommy culture is a very real phenomenon, and that goes right along with many times mommy wine culture, just this kind of very nagging, negative attitude on Facebook and Instagram, especially from these mommy bloggers about, oh my gosh, my children, oh, they drive me so crazy. I can't stand being mom. I just need wine all the time to get through this. I think that's part of toxic mommy culture, and I don't think it's good. I think I don't know exactly where we crossed the line, but as a whole, when I see a lot of mommy bloggers out there, they cross the line from being real and honest about how difficult motherhood is to just downright just talking trash on their kids and telling stories that later I read some of these mommy bloggers and I'm like, oh wow, did you really just say that on the internet? What happens when later your child sees this? That's not something I would have put out for the whole world to see. I wouldn't even want my own child or family to see. That's past the line of being real and honest about a heartfelt, difficult place where you're at, to almost a hatred for your children being expressed online. So we know that that is a lot of how the world feels about children. I actually recently read this blog literally like 2 mornings ago, and it was, the title of it was "Children Ruin Your Life." And then I read it, and I thought it was going to be just like one of those titles that pulls you in, but then later they like explain and it makes sense and it's not as horrible. But no, the article was just as horrible as the title, and it was truly just about how children ruin your life. But it left me with this question, and I don't need to repeat the article to you. I thought about sharing it, but you kind of get the picture just from the title. But I think it depends on, what do you think the purpose of your life is? I think we have as a culture shifted from children, especially as we used to be more of a Christian culture. Christian culture would say children are purpose in your life. They're part of your life. They're part of God's plan for your life, to raise them up to follow Christ. And it's very much about mission and not about, let me have this child so it'll make my life perfect. If you are going into it with a me attitude and a self attitude going into having children, then of course they're gonna ruin your life. Because if your life was perfect before you had children, the idea of doing whatever, whenever you wanted, then yeah, that would ruin your life. But that's not the way Christians are supposed to look at children. I want to read you a note from Dennis Prager's book, Genesis, God, Creation, and Destruction. It's called the Rational Bible series. Now, Dennis Prager, you've probably heard me talk about him in the past. He's a phenomenal Jewish scholar, but he shares some interesting notes that I want to share with you. He says here, he says, the West, at present time, with rare exceptions, the people who have large families, 4 or more children, are religious, devout Roman Catholics, Orthodox Jews, evangelical Christians, and faithful Mormons. I would also mention, polygamists, but that's totally another subject, mostly a joke that I mentioned that. Meanwhile, the irreligious, with the exception of some of those relying on state assistance, increasingly have few or no children. The same holds true for marriage. The religious are more likely to marry, and these are 2 examples of how differently people who base their lives on the Bible live from those who do not. The most widely accepted explanations for people having fewer children are affluence and greater independence for women. So that's what we're going to be told very frequently. You'll probably see this yourself of, no, I don't want to have lots of kids, especially from women. Oh, I don't want to have kids because I want to have a career. Children will get in the way of my career, so they're more career focused. And I'm not saying you can't have a career and children. That's another topic for another day. I'm just saying there's a difference between being career focused and family focused. And I think we can all acknowledge that, regardless of where you stand on that. Dennis goes on. He says, this does not account for why affluent religious people continue to have many children. Therefore, one must add what is one of the most, and perhaps the most important explanations for low birth rates in the modern world: secularism with its commitment abandonment of the Bible. Now he goes on to explain, and this is what pulled it together for me, and I wanted to share with you. He says, and why do secular people have so few children? The primary reason is that without God and without religion, people are understandably determined to enjoy the only world they believe exists, the material world. Without God, only matter is real. Such people consciously or unconsciously reason that one should therefore enjoy this world as much as possible in the short amount of time that one exists. And children are regarded, not without reason, as depriving parents of the ability to enjoy many of life's pleasures. In addition to the great financial expenses associated with raising children, it is much more difficult to eat out, go to the movies, and travel abroad as often as one would like when one has to take care of children. And I'm going to stop right there. I think Dennis brings up a fabulous point. The reason why so much of our secular world not only has very few or no children, but the children that they do have very frequently can fall into these children ruined my life. Well, if your life is only being lived in pursuit of physical pleasures because you're here for a short time and then you're gone forever, and there's no heaven, there is no afterlife, there's no greater purpose for being here, then yeah, why would you have kids? They would supposedly ruin your life if that's your idea of why you're here on earth. So I think it's very important to recognize that the way the world sees children and the way that Christians do, or I say should see children, is very different. And that is going to, I needed to preface that specifically because I'm going to go into more about how our views differ from the world and how that's going to affect IVF and the IVF and surrogacy conversation. So I want to also, I wish I could put like all this in all caps, but I'm speaking it. But I also want to point out and make this very clear before I go into this conversation that all children, regardless of how they were conceived, whether that was rape or incest or surrogacy or IVF, all children are image bearers of God. They're made in God's image and their lives have value. So even though I'm going to have some difficult thoughts on these subjects, I want you to know that all children who are here today are obviously beautiful and they have value. And then also there's gonna be those of you who message me inevitably, well, what about people who don't get married and have children? Of course, you know, that's another subject. The Bible does say, you know, yes, if you decide, you know, if you don't have children, then you have more time and energy to focus your life on God and pursuing His will and spirituality. Obviously, you know, when you have children, that's another realm. You are going to be distracted in some senses by marriage and children, but that's another episode. Now, I also want to point out that as a general rule, the Bible always addresses infertility. The few times that it does, it addresses infertility as sad, as something that is mournful, and always addresses pregnancy as joyful. So I think that gives us also a hint, but even though it doesn't spell it out, it gives us a hint towards more clearly understanding that the Bible does view children as a blessing and as beautiful. Now, also, if you're a Christian, I would say most, if not, I would say most Christians, at least those who study and are a little zealous at finding answers, would agree that life begins at conception. And interestingly enough, most of science agrees. I would say all, you know, legitimate science, you know, I've had those crazy people send me their paper from their professor who's a scientist or whatever, but I'm saying general science agrees that life also begins at conception. Now, what does it mean? For those who may not know, life beginning conception means when an egg comes down and a sperm comes up and they meet and the egg is fertilized by the sperm. That is conception. That is when life is conceived. You now have, you know, new DNA formed. You have life beginning its way. We are no longer just a sperm and just an egg. We are a new life. That is when life begins. Now, a lot of birth controls I have qualms with, and many other Christians have qualms with, because if you believe life begins at conception, that makes a lot of birth control options out of the question. I did an entire episode specifically on this topic. You can go check out. It's, I believe it's just titled Birth Control, and it's probably one of the most listened to episodes that I have, because it is such a difficult subject to address. But I address that in depth, and I will talk all about, you'll hear all about birth control. I'll put a link in the description of this episode. You can find it easily, but go listen to that one on birth control. You definitely, if you haven't already listened to that, definitely listen to that. And I'm gonna encourage you, moms and even fathers, if you have teenage daughters especially, this would be very good information. The birth control episode would be especially good information for them to understand, to know, especially as they go forward in life and have a lot of friends who might be not having parents who will discuss these issues with them. All right, now let's talk about IVF. IVF, for those of you who might not understand, or might not be familiar, IVF, in vitro fertilization, is basically the process where a couple will take eggs from a woman, usually the mom. Sometimes if that doesn't work out, eggs will be taken from a different woman, and sperm, usually again from the dad, and they will fertilize those eggs with that sperm in a lab. Then they will take a few of them and implant them into the woman. And so hopefully, or not implant them, they'll place them in the woman, and hopefully one or a few will implant and carry to term. Now, where the question comes in, and why this is such an uncomfortable subject for many, is, can you be a Christian who believes in this, who supports in vitro fertilization, and is it pro-life to to support in vitro fertilization. The reason why those come into question is not that the process is inherently bad, the process of taking an egg and taking sperm and fertilizing those and putting them in the woman is bad. That part is fine. I think most, if not all, Christians would agree that part isn't evil, that part isn't questionable, that part is perfectly fine. The question comes in because usually many more eggs are fertilized in the lab than are placed in the woman. And those eggs that are remaining, where do they go? Most of the options are that will those frozen eggs, will they stay frozen and then be used later by that mother, which doesn't always happen, or will those eggs be donated to science, or will they just be thrown out? Now, if you agree with the initial Christian premise that life begins at conception, if you agree with that, then conception has happened. Then those are human lives, and you can't go back and unmake those human lives. So you are taking those human lives and throwing them out or donating them to science, or leaving them frozen for a long time until they're thrown out or donated to science. Now that's where it becomes tricky, is if you believe life begins at conception, you're presented with a moral dilemma. Now, this is a really difficult subject, and I would be lying if I didn't admit that it tears at my heart a little because, you know, having miscarried last year for a brief moment while we were trying to get pregnant again, I realized how badly it can hurt. And I think I just barely got a teeny little taste. I don't even pretend to understand the pain that those who struggle with infertility go through. I'm just saying I got the teeniest little tip of the iceberg, little taste of what it can feel like to yearn for a child and multiple months in a row not be pregnant and feel crushed over and over. And so I can only imagine what parents, the pain, emotional pain that parents are going through when they're trying to conceive and they can't, and so they opt for in vitro fertilization. So I'm trying so hard to approach this with compassion and love because I think that's what's needed. And so here's the thing, is I can see why so many people, especially Christians, are opting for IVF. And I want to answer this with just the deepest heartfelt sincerity, especially because I have loved ones on this earth who I dearly love, who were conceived from IVF. And I wouldn't not have them here. I, in a million years, wouldn't want them here. I would, that sounds weird. I would never want to be without them because they're beautiful human beings and I love them. And I'm very, very, very grateful and blessed, and as other parents, to have those beautiful souls here. So of course I have loved ones who are born from you know, who were conceived through IVF, and they're miracle babies for all intents and purposes. And science does have its upside in so many ways, and this is one of them. The problem is what about those extra eggs again? So the truth is, I think that this is going to be a difficult answer for many of you, but I think IVF, I believe in my heart that IVF can, in vitro fertilization, can be acceptable as a Christian and also as a pro-lifer with parameters. I believe those parameters are that you should only fertilize as many eggs as you are willing to keep and try to give them a chance to implant. I know that's incredibly financially stressful because you're harvesting X amount of eggs and fertilizing X amount of eggs, and it costs money to do that process all over again. So I understand I'm not trying to flippantly say, oh, just only fertilize like, you know, 3 at a time and see what happens, or 2 at a time. I understand that that's incredibly financially stressful, and I'm not trying to say that flippantly, but I'm saying from a moral perspective, as someone who believes that life begins at conception, both as a pro-life person, but more importantly as a Christian, that there have to be parameters on IVF as Christians, and we should only fertilize as many eggs as we are willing to keep. I know that's financially difficult, but morally it does not make sense to believe that we are, you know, made in God's image, and that we are known in our mother's womb, and that we're conceived and we are human, and then also at the same time be okay with those fertilized babies of ours, those fertilized eggs, it's not okay to throw them out, and it's not okay to make them human, scientific research. The same way I would be against, human fetal tissue from abortions being used to create vaccines. I'm also against using human beings, fertilized eggs who are embryos now, but they're human beings. I'm also against those being used for science. Also, I think another difficult part with IVF is the idea of picking and choosing which life is worth effort or not. I think it brings into the idea of eugenics, and picking the perfect, the more perfect egg to try and get to implant, eliminating eggs that scientists might think will end up with special needs or Down syndrome. I'm not saying that we can test for all those now, but I'm looking future pacing into what science will look like, years from now, and also being able to tell male, female. It leaves it open to both eugenics. I think there's a lot of abuse happening in the current IVF room or IVF area, and there is room for even more abuse that I think we should be very, very wary of. So, can you be pro-life and Christian and pro-IVF? Yes, but I believe with parameters, hopefully that makes sense to you. Now, surrogacy. I have a bigger problem with surrogacy. I'm going to straight up with you. Of course, all children born through through surrogate's mother are, of course, just as valuable, just as beautiful human beings. The thing with surrogacy that really throws me off, and for those who aren't familiar, the basic idea is taking either just an egg from mom or an egg and sperm, from mom and dad, fertilizing it in a lab, and then placing that egg in a different woman to be the surrogate and grow the baby. I think the most famous example is, I believe, the last couple of babies that Kim Kardashian and Kanye West have had were born through surrogate mothers, which is interesting. I won't comment on that. But basically, the reason I have a problem with surrogacy is it feels like playing with children for selfish reasons. I know that sounds terrible, but I really do feel that way, because the thing is, children, babies, they are bonded to their mother, whether they're biologically related to the mother or not, which in some cases they are. They'll take the surrogate's eggs and the father's sperm, and they will conceive with those and plant those in the mother, or they'll use there's a few different scenarios. I won't go into every one of them, but the thing is I compare it a little bit to adoption. Adoption is called a difficult choice for a reason, because a mother is biologically and spiritually and physically bonded to the child that she grows. And a child instinctively reaches for the mother that grew them, whether they're biologically related or not. The mother that they spent the last 9 months, or actually more like 10 months in her womb. It is a creation that we've mixed with personal desire. We're so, maybe a mother and a father can't have a child together, but they're so set on their DNA being the DNA that they raise that they would purposely create an adoption situation. Now, adoption is a beautiful thing. I do not want anyone to walk away with the idea that I'm dissing on adoption. Adoption is absolutely beautiful, but if we're being honest, adoption is taking a less than ideal situation and making it a beautiful, heartfelt choice for both for the mother, allowing her child to be adopted, and for the couple who lovingly wants to adopt a child who maybe can't or doesn't, either can't be raised by the mother, or the mother doesn't want to raise that child. And it is, we're trying to make the very best out of a less than ideal situation. That's what adoption is. And I'm saying this as someone who was adopted by one of my parents. My mother is my biological mother. My dad is not my biological dad, but in a spiritual and emotional way, he is my dad in every single way. And it's a beautiful thing. Adoption is beautiful. Being adopted by my dad is one of the most beautiful blessings I have in my life. And I don't take that for granted, that I was able to have that adoption experience. I know it's not the same as being adopted, you know, as a child or through the foster system. I'm just saying I have a tiny taste of maybe what that feels like. But again, that was a less than ideal situation. My mother was living a polygamous relationship. I was without a father for all intents and purposes until my mother married my father when I was 8 years old. But adoption is taking a less than perfect and less than ideal situation and trying to turn it to the good. Whereas surrogacy is purposely creating that less than ideal situation. Why would we intentionally go out of our way to create a situation where mother and baby are being separated? Whether that's biological mother, just the mother, I'm going to refer as the surrogate mother, the one who grew the child in her womb. Why would we intentionally detach that? That is the natural way that God created children to come. We're trying our best to fix it through adoption, and it is a beautiful solution in those cases. But why would we go out of our way to create an adoption less than ideal situation? It just doesn't make sense. And again, I think this comes back to the world has a very different view on children than Christians do. Christians view the family unit as something that is desirable, something to pursue after. That's the way God created the family, for one mother, one father to raise those children. You know, divorce wasn't supposed to be part of God's plan. I don't know that surrogacy was necessarily part of God's plan. Now we do see that kind of a little bit in the Bible with Sarah and Abraham. You know, Sarah gives her handmaiden to Abraham, but we see that didn't really, it doesn't say anything about God condoning that, first of all, and then second of all, we see that didn't really turn out super well because Sarah had some serious jealousy issues. But setting that aside, we have in today's world come up with this view as children. Children aren't here more of in a mission mindset of, you know, God's gifted me with this beautiful human life. We're going to do our best to raise it up, to follow God's ways. No, we've started to adopt this culture of children are here to fulfill me. They're here to fulfill my desires, my idea of what an ideal life looks like. And so when we don't have, perhaps if unfortunately we can't conceive on our own with our, you know, with our husband, we believe, oh, you know what, children are about me. Children is about my desire, and they're not thinking about the child that they are intentionally bringing into this world to not be with its mother, who it grew in, and to not be bonded with that woman who it spent those 9-10 months growing inside of. You know, children are supposed to be more God-centric, not self-centric. And we've corrupted it so far past it being about God's family unit and what we've designed, or what God's designed as his will and his plan. But no, it's about whatever we want, whatever fills our desire, whatever, because children are about us. It doesn't matter what the child's feelings may be, and if they may, you know, have, you know, to work through some different things later in life, you know, and there's a lot of stats, especially when the father isn't biologically related to the child. There are a lot of stats that show that there's higher rates of abuse. So you bring in the potential, not a guarantee, but there is a higher potential for abuse for children born through, you know, surrogacy, where you're intentionally creating a child born through surrogacy that's not maybe related to the father, maybe because he can't. But we're also creating situations where, you know, where two women want a baby, or two men who want a baby. I saw this story the other day where it was two men who wanted a baby, so they literally implanted, they did IVF essentially, with I believe either the son or the son's partner's sperm and the mother's egg, and then use the mother as a surrogate. And then I saw another interesting story the other day where it was the daughter and her husband couldn't get pregnant, so they took the daughter's egg and the husband's sperm. They, in IVF, you know, created that human life and then implanted it in the daughter's mom, and the mom at 51 is growing her first grandchild, and her daughter's first child, and something just seems really wrong about that. I'm still trying to put that one into words, but something just seems really wrong about that. We've become so self-centeredly focused on what we want and our ideal idea of how we want our child to come to us and what genetics we want our child to come to us, that we've moved past it being a God-centered idea of having children to this is just about me and what I want and my desires, and not even thinking about even maybe the child and how that might be. And honestly, I would not want to be in that kind of relationship. Holy cow, can you imagine what it's going to be like for the grandma to give birth to her first grandchild and then hand that child, whom she's bonded to physically and genetically to some extent, and she's bonded to this child, and then giving it to her daughter and her son-in-law? How is that going to be? How is that going to play out for this mom who's going to then be grandma, but really she's also mom? That's just would not. That sounds like a nightmare waiting to happen. I'm just saying relationship-wise. Then we have a whole nother thing, you know, this is not quite surrogacy, but even with IVF, where we have single mothers or women who are like, well, I can't find someone to marry, and you know, I just don't know when it's going to happen, so I'm just going to become a single mom on purpose, and I'm going to go to a sperm bank. And again, it goes back to the self-centric, self-serving. It's not, hey, out of the goodness, out of my heart, I can't find any, you know, I'm not finding the right man for me, I'm not getting married, but I still want to have children. The beautiful thing to do in that situation would be to adopt a child who needs a home, or a foster children or a child who needs a home. But no, we're going to be selfish because we want it to be our DNA, and we're going to intentionally bring a child into, knowingly and intentionally bring a child into this world as a single mom who's, this child will probably never know their father. And that's sad. It's sad when it happens in nature to be born to a single mom and to not have a father, and just statistically, without a father, you have a higher chance of not completing school, of going to jail. There's just a lot of scientific and proof and the stats behind it is better to have a child in a two-parent stable household. So to intentionally create single motherhood and a child coming to a single mother for selfish reasons is just beyond selfish in every way. I don't feel like that word even fully describes that situation, but it just all around, we have to remember that the world is increasingly, even now it feels like the world is so different. They don't want the family unit. They don't want to identify there being two genders. The world is consistently going to push us into a world where children are about the parents. It's about what the parents want, parents' ideal child, and the ideal gender, and the ideal genetics, and it's about me, and it's self-centric, and not about it being God-focused and bringing in a blessing from the Lord, or adopting a blessing from the Lord and giving that child the, you know, the best tools for life, but past that, raising that child to, you know, have faith and be a believer and follow Jesus Christ. It's going to be very different. So, you know, it's going to be difficult for many of you to listen to this episode, and I'm so sorry if I have hurt you in any way or offended you or left you feeling like I was being abrasive or unkind. That is not my goal in any of this. I'm just trying to share a perspective that I have come to after, again, much prayer and research and studying my Bible to try and understand this from a as biblical perspective as I feel like I can get to. This is where I'm at today. But again, if you have information you feel like maybe I missed, or an opinion that I didn't address, please feel free to reach out to me, conservativebabes@gmail.com, or message me on Instagram. Facebook, I probably don't check that nearly. I probably check that a couple times a year, so Facebook is not a good bet for you. But if you enjoyed this episode and you felt like it was enlightening, or maybe discussed this topic that made more sense to you, or you feel like even that this is something that could be food for thought for someone else, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, on iTunes. Go ahead and share this with a friend. Again, I think that while this is a difficult topic, especially young people need to be more aware of this from a Christian conservative perspective, what this might look like, because the world is going to tell them that children is all about you and your desires. Then we're going to go ahead and end real quick, actually, on good in the world. So I'm doing this a little differently than I've ever done before. I'm going to link, and you're going to see it, it's going to say good in the world. I'm going to link this good in the world Facebook video and you can watch it, but essentially what you're going to see in this beautiful video is it's a female black police officer, and she shares how she was telling her friends and family on Facebook that they should, love others and embrace others and try and show kindness to others. And then she finds herself driving to work the next morning and just, realizes she's low on gas. She needs to stop and get gas. So, after a little bit of debate, she goes to a gas station, she's getting gas, and a young man walks up to her and just says, hey, can I pray for you? Can I pray for your safety? And she's just bawling and she's emotional while recording this video later in her car, but just saying, hey, you know what? We have to be the good in the world. We have to be the change that we want to see. And she's just like, I'm really trying, but I just saw that today when that young man, was praying over me. And I just thought it was so beautiful, so moving and touching. And I want to echo what this wonderful police officer is saying. And that is, we do have to be the good in the world. And we're all running around right now yelling and saying, hey, stop race baiting, stop, slamming, my friends for X, Y, and Z reasons, stop being an angry, outrage monster online. Maybe we also need to check ourselves and be like, hey, how can I be more loving? Still stand up for your values, still stand up for what you believe in, but how can I be more loving to my friends and my family and my community and your neighbors? So if you want to watch that video, I would highly recommend it. It will leave you with a warm feeling in your heart. But I'll go ahead and link that under good in the world in the description below. God bless you. God bless America. Have a great day. This is Deconstructing the Culture, and I am your host, Elisa Steele.
Hey, conservative babes. Thanks so much for being part of the tribe. Seriously, I am so blown away, not just by you guys being amazing listeners, but you guys send so many things to me, both on Instagram and email, and you share things that you want to be discussed or covered on the podcast. Your feedback means a whole heck of a lot to me. And also, not only that, but I want you to know, kudos to you for making this podcast what it is, because it's grown 100% word of mouth, and that's because of you, my friend. So thank you so much for your continual recommendation of this podcast, sharing it with friends and family. And also, I just want to ask you, if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and subscribe on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play Music, wherever you listen, and leave a review. If you're watching on YouTube, then go ahead and hit the notification bell. Nowadays, you can do subscriptions all day long and subscribe to someone's channel. So subscribe, but it's also important you hit the notification bell. All right, guys, see you next week.